Hi, this is Zaiste Programming. My name is Jakub, and today we will be doing a live stream about creating a very simple React.js application for browsing video games. So the idea is to show you how to create a React.js app, how to create a GraphQL server in Node, and then how to connect React.js frontend with this GraphQL backend. And then we will show how this GraphQL server can communicate with database. In our case, this will be a PostgreSQL database, so that using ORM called Prisma, we will be extracting, querying the database to get the data and send it back over the wire from the GraphQL server to the React.js application. So let me show you first the actual app we are going to build. So I prepare it in advance. So this is an app that displays the games I'm looking forward to play in the future. And we can, for example, search for them. So if I type some letters like Somerville or serial cleaners or replaced, this happens on the client. And then when the app loads, there is a request that goes to our GraphQL server. Let's see that. And it fetches the data. So we have, a collection of games, and those games are stored in a PostgreSQL database, and the React.js asks our GraphQL server for this data. So the app is very simple, but the idea here is more to show you how to connect all the pieces so you have a better understanding how this could be done. And this is not the only way of doing that. There's plenty of possibilities, and we also are just scratching the surface here because there's a lot of things that should be considered when building a real app, like testing and security, maybe having a notion of users so that you can log in and log out, etc. There's one thing I forgot to mention, one little feature I implemented as well. You can make certain games favorite, but for now you cannot display it anywhere. So maybe we will have a chance to implement that. Okay, so let's maybe create this app from scratch. So I will just stop it here. And let me go just from the very beginning. Let's just see what we can just arrange the tabs. So the app is stopped. So the first thing we are going to use is a project called Cretis. Is a programming environment for TypeScript. So this is like a Kickstarter for your project. So it just gives you this basic structure so you can go a little bit faster. So let's try to do this. So first of all, you need to install it. So you do just npm install, and you can install it globally. And then you can create a new project, new TypeScript project. And in Cretis, there is this notion. I will call our project Gameyard. Okay, so there's an update from macOS. Let's just cancel that. Okay, so our project will be called Gameyard, and in Cretis there is this notion of templates. So you can, for example, have a React template, a Vue.js template if you are building a Vue. You can have solid.js template, and there are other templates as well. We will be using React.js, and let's generate the app. So this command gives us this basic structure. It installs the dependencies. I'm not sure if this is visible. I mean, in terms of font, maybe I will make it bigger. Let me just if you have any comments, let me know. Yeah, so we generated the app, installed some dependencies, including React. So it says we should open the directory, and then we can use VS Code to browse the files. And let me increase the font so it's more convenient for you to see what I'm doing. Let's maybe make it a little bit bigger. So the first thing we can do is to start this application. So we can do create a start, or there is also an alias KS, which is the same thing, which means create a start. So now we are seeing that we have an error because we don't have a database yet, but this is not a problem. The application starts on port 5544. And this is a very basic structure. So we have some counter, nothing too crazy. And now we can start creating our own applications. So the first thing would be to use database. So in our case, we want to have Postgres. So I will be using, so I'm on Mac. So I used brew to install Postgres. You should install it according to your operating system. So if you go to Postgres and downloads, I believe there are instructions for different operating systems. And once you have Postgres installed, we can start it. So I will just use, I prefer to start it this way. So it's not run in the background. It's run in the foreground. And I can see what happens here. So I have it running. And now if I go back here, I stop my application, make it a little bit bigger, and I start it again. So there's no longer this error about the database because our app connected to the database. But we haven't really configured anything. So let's do that now. So the first thing we should be aware of is that in Kretis, we have this split between the server code, which is run in Node.js, and client, which is run in browser. So on client, this is where our React.js application is being built, and server is where we have, for example, our GraphQL API and like middlewares. We have some server-side routes, or we can have asynchronous jobs, etc. So the first thing would be to to configure the database. So I need to go to config, and here in default JSON, I have DB, and I can just say the name of database. So in our case, let's call it Gameyard, the same name we used for the project. And let me stop it. Let me start it once again. And now Kretis says that you need to create Gameyard database because we haven't done it yet. So I can, for example, open a new window here, new shell, and I can say Kretis DB setup. And this tries to remove a database from your server instance and then create it again. So if you are doing development, you can easily recreate if you are making some mistakes in schema or you want to change the schema. At the beginning, at least, you can do the setup. Usually you do it once, because if we use something like Prisma, we have this notion of migrations, so we don't have to do that. But this way we have our database created, and we can verify that. So if I just open PSQL and I connect my database, I see that I have the database, but I don't have any relations in that database. Okay, so now we would need to create some relations or some tables, and we could For example, let me just, I will, let's go with a simple table. So here in server DB, so DB is on the server, we have this file called setup SQL. So when we ran this create DB setup, we were dropping the database, then we were creating database, and then we were setting it up, which means that this command was trying to run this file, this SQL file. And in our case, we just want to have, just for the starters, a very simple one table called game. So I'm old school, and I prefer to name my tables in a singular form because it's easier for me. But nowadays, people tend to use plural. So do as you prefer. And so we have ID, we have a bit of name, let's use maybe title. Games have titles. And we will have description, which will be also text. And now I will be fetching the game information from Steam, which is this platform for games, and they provide an API. So I will use Steam ID, and I will also say text. And finally, maybe released at. And normally this could be a timestamp, but because Steam API returns strings, because sometimes you can have things like, to be announced or something of that sort, we will use text as well here. So it's simpler so we don't worry about this edge case. And once we have this, we can now go back here and we can rerun setup. Everything is okay. And now if I go back and I connect to our database, I see that I have relation, and I can see that it properly created those columns. And if I try to query from game, it's empty, so we don't have anything. Okay, so now we have that. Let's try to connect with Prisma. So Prisma is this ORM for TypeScript, and it's extremely convenient. And the great thing about Prisma is that if you connect it to your application, it can scan your database and your tables and infer the tables and the relations between them. So that's pretty great. So in our case, we want to add Prisma to an existing project. And the first thing we need to install it. So let's install it. So here I will install Prisma, and I'm using pnpm instead of npm. So we have Prisma installed, and now we need to run Prisma. So we need to run init. So pnpx Prisma init. And this creates a file, Prisma schema Prisma. And the problem is that we don't want to have this file here at the top level. We would prefer it to have it inside DB. So I'll just grab it and move it here. And I will remove this directory. And now I need to tell Prisma where this file is. So I will go to package.json. And somewhere here, I will say Prisma that schema, I believe it's schema. Let me just check yeah, it's schema. So server DB schema Prisma. So it's server DB schema Prisma. So from now on, we can use that location. So let's check the schema Prisma first. So it uses a data source. So it's PostgreSQL, and we need to define the database URL. So we need to go to env here, and Prisma already added this to our file. So this comment explains this. We can remove that like that. And here I will just say Zaiste with my username. I have a password, localhost, and our database is called Gameyard. And now what we need to do is to generate the client. So we need to do the introspect. So let's try doing that. Introspect. So I'm using npx. You can use npx Prisma introspect. And let's try to run this. So there is this problem. I've seen it on GitHub that it somehow fails to recognize the proper format. But normally you don't need to worry about this information. There is some like a tiny lag, but everything works. And now if we go back to our schema, we see that it generated the model. So it went to our database. It scanned the database for tables and relations and other stuff. And it saw that we have just one table with those columns, and the tool generated this for us. So it's pretty great. Okay, so we have that, and the next step would be to maybe create some data in our database. So we will use seed here, and it's already partially generated for us, but we will be using Prisma. So we need to do import Prisma client from Prisma client, and I need to install it. So let me just check the documentation. Yeah, so we need to install this. Let me go back. npm add Prisma client. Let me check if I have any comments. No comments. If I'm going too slow, let me know, or too fast. Okay, so we have the Prisma client. Everything works here. So we need to create a Prisma client, and here in main, we will try to seed our data. So let me just do something like results, Prisma, and as you can see, when I type G, it knows that I have table game inside my database. Now I can do create many in this case, and data. And here, what's cool about Prisma is that if I start writing, it knows now that I have title in my database. So I can just, a game and description. It knows that this exists. What else? Steam ID. Steam ID and release date. Let's see, to be announced, something like that. Yeah, and that should be it. we should also maybe wrap it inside a try and catch, just so that we have this finally operation, and we can say Prisma connect. And now we can run setup again. Well, in fact, we didn't have to, but okay. So now it stops because the problem is that we have a running app which is connected to the database. So there's a connection. So I need to stop it. But so okay. So now I think the problem is that Prisma is listening on a port. So let me just check my assumption. Yeah, there is some, I think, Prisma process or not. Let's see. Or maybe I forgot to disconnect. Yeah, I forgot to disconnect from here. Works. So we set it. We set the database again, but we didn't have to do that. And now we can use the command seed, which will run this seed file we just created. So let's try and to do this. It's okay. And let's go to our database and let's try to query. And we have it. So it works. So now we can, add more game 2, maybe a game 3. And so I cannot seed again because it will, well, we could at least, but this will just append the data. So we will have not 3, but 4 games. But it's good enough. We can work with that. So one thing, important things to, let's maybe change the Steam ID for some real ones. So I'll just quickly copy the actual Steam IDs for now, just so we can fetch some data, and I will set it up again. Okay, so it's connected here. And seed. Okay. And let's verify that we have the data. We have the data. That's the first step. We use Prisma, we store the data, we created one table, we inspected the database with Prisma, so we were able to infer the structure of this database, and then we created a seed file through by using Prisma client, and we using the create many operation, we were able to insert 3 records into our database. So now we would like to expose an API in our application so that, for example, our React frontend could connect with that. And we will be using GraphQL for that. So in Kretes, most of the work needed to create a GraphQL server is already done for you. So what we need to do is to go to config, default, and here there is a thing called GraphQL, and it could be false and true. If you set it to true, it will automatically expose a very basic GraphQL server. So let's try this. And this server is located on the server side, of course. So in the server directory, so there is this catalog generated, and it provides a very simple query. So when you ask for hello, it returns hello Cretis. And if you create a GraphQL server, there are two things. You have types and you have resolvers. So the types, describe the structure, and resolvers describe the actual actions that happen when you ask for those things. And so now, if we just flipped GraphQL from false, which is default, to true, I can run the server again. Now, as you can see, it displays that it's using GraphQL. And if we go to our app, it's still the same. If we go to underscore GraphQL, which is this browser, there's this tool called GraphQL, which is the a browser ID tool. So you can use it to explore your GraphQL servers. And it's already built into Cretis as well. So if we go here and we click docs, we see that we have a query, and this query have hello, and it returns string. So this corresponds to our GraphQL file over here, right? Because we have query, type query, which has hello and returns string, and the hello returns this message over here. So if I just create a very simple GraphQL query now, hello, I run it, it returns hello Cretis. And I can play with that. So I can say hello YouTube. Right, I save, and it works. It's hello YouTube. So now we would like to have a possibility to execute a query that would return our games through this server. And so the idea would be that we would like to say games, for example, and eventually maybe, to be able to filter that. And then we can specify certain fields like title, Steam ID, the fields that we define in our database. So let's try to do that. Let's try to define such GraphQL server. So let's maybe start with games. So games would be a collection of games. So, the square brackets represent a collection, and there is a type game, which doesn't exist yet. So let's create that. So game, and this type will have title, which will be a string, and Steam ID will be a string, and maybe released at, which will be also a string. And in GraphQL, the types are uppercase. It's uppercase string, while in TypeScript is lowercase. But this, okay, so we have that, and now we need to implement a resolver for that. So we would need something like games, and let me think. So this will be a function that returns some things from our database. So let me think. We could do await, so we need Prisma for that. Something like that. Or maybe let me think. So something like that. Prisma game. This needs to be async. Find many. This should do. Turn, of course. Let me check. So we have a query, which is top level type. There are two things: games, that returns a collection of game, and hello, which was already there. And type is titles, team ID, release ID. And we need to have a resolver that corresponds, that can return those, respond to this query, the games query. So this name must match this name. And because we are doing an asynchronous operation, we are awaiting the data fetching through Prisma from our database. This needs to be async. And let's see if it works. I wonder. GraphQL validation error. Works. It was easier than I thought. There is a problem here, however. So we are able to return our free games we inserted into the database. Just that Steam ID is not able to get the data, because the problem is that here we used underscore. So normally in database you use underscore, and in JavaScript you use the camel case, and now we need to change that. So let me think. I think Prisma should be able to do it automatically. I'm not sure. Is it the case? Or maybe, no, let's maybe leave it as is. And well, I don't want to maybe do it right now. It's a detail. So let's leave it like that with underscores. And what else we had there? We had released add. So let's see if it works. Okay, it works. That's good. How we are on time. Yes, I'm using, just let me see the comments. Yes, I'm using GitHub Copilot. It's pretty cool. It's not perfect. I wouldn't say it's like, but it's sometimes, pretty often guesses what I want to write, as you could see. So yes, this is Copilot. It's over here. And the other question. Okay, how can I survive without Emacs? Well, I'm using Emacs still, but for the purpose of this video, and I think in JavaScript community, Emacs is not very popular. So I think using VS Code is more convenient for most users, for most viewers, and they can easily repeat what they see on screen if I use VS Code. So that's the reason of me not using Emacs for this particular scenario. Okay, so let's continue. Now I would like to connect, I want to show you how to connect React with this GraphQL endpoint we created. So we have GraphQL endpoint. It's an API that we have in our application, and we can now try to display this data on the client. So we are switching from the server to the client. And on the client, we have a very simple component app, and most of those things can be removed. So by default, Cretus uses this library called React Query, which is data for connecting with APIs. And usually you use it with REST APIs, and you can also use it with GraphQL. But today, we will use something which is more tailored for GraphQL, and this is called URQL. So React queries are a very general approach for fetching data, and URQL is for GraphQL APIs. So first, let's install that. Oops. Have this. I can remove most of those things. Like that. Hello, YouTube. Let's see if it works. So if we go, let's keep it open here, the GraphQL, and let's, yeah. So we have a very simple app. And now we want to make a request from this place so that we can, get these games and display them in React. So what we need to do, we need to create a client, GraphQL client. So let me just check my notes so it's easier. So the first thing would be to, so let's go to site client. And here, instead of using React query, we will use the URQL. And URQL provides a method called create client. And we will also need provider. So we can inject this client into the component tree of our React application. And our client will be create client, something like that. And this requires URL. So it guesses something. Copilot guesses something, but as you remember, we ran on 5544 and we have underscore in the name. And we have an error because this is not new. This is just a function. Okay, we have that, and here we use the provider to inject the client so it's available. And so the provider is a component that injects the client we created here, that recognizes that at this URL we have our GraphQL server, and that's all. And now in the widgets below this point, we can use, we can make queries. So for example, let's try to make a query here. So we will need import use query from URQL, like that. And we need to make a query first. So let's make a game query. And this will be just a string. Query, games, title, and description. So if I type GraphQL here, I should have some syntax highlighting. There's a plugin for that in VS Code. I just don't remember which one. I think GraphQL. Yeah, GraphQL. So we have this. We can just copy this query and we can go back to our GraphQL. We don't need to use query here and we can run it. Okay, because the problem is that we haven't defined, let me think, we haven't defined description here. In our GraphQL server. So now if I run this, it works. Okay. And let's go back to app. So we have this query, it works. And it also should be working in here in our server. So we have the result, use query. And it's a query, game query, variables like that. And now we need to destructure. So we have data, fetching, and error. And if it's fetching, we will return a div loading. If it's error, we will return error. Maybe we could display the message. And if it's data, we can display the data. So let's do something like a very basic. We will just stringify the data. This should display the list, the collection we are getting from the server, if everything works as expected. And here I can remove that. Here as well. So this is working. It works. So we were able to connect. We are in the browser now and React. So this use query is constructing a query in the browser using this, what we described here. And it's sending that to our server, which is defined under this URL. So when we define the GraphQL client, it will be sending those requests to this URL. And then we are getting the data back. And we have three states, two states. When we are sending the query, we are waiting for the results. So I'm not sure this will be visible because this happens instantly, but if we maybe we can simulate that. So if I did something like, if I waited here, well, let's forget about that. Normally, if this operation takes a longer time, it will be displaying the loading information here. And if there's an error for some reason, so if, for example, I say that I want a field that doesn't exist, we are getting this error displayed. And then if everything is okay, we are getting the data and we are displaying it here. So what we could do is that we could, for example, do a simple list, right? And we could just say data, games, let me think, return game title. Is it okay? I messed something, I think. Implicit return. So that should be game, but I haven't defined that. Will this work? It works. So I can, for example, I can say h2, right? And I can say div description. It's kind of like a collection of games that's being displayed. But the important point here is that we are able to connect with our server from React.js. So as you can see, it's pretty easy, I would say. It's not that complicated. Of course, there are some edge cases and nuances here. We can improve that as well, because sometimes you don't want to write your queries by hand. You could do some more like there's a smarter approach here. But for now, it's good enough. So we started with database, PostgreSQL. We created our table. Then we use Prisma to inspect the database, to learn about the relations, the tables. This created our file, schema file. And then Prisma was able to infer the columns. And when we were writing our inserts, everything was available to us. We inserted data. We used a seed file. Then we created a GraphQL server, which is just a simple resolver that gets everything from the game table and returns that. So again, this is not perfect because normally you would like to whitelist or just use certain fields, not all of them. And we expose that GraphQL server, and then we used URQL to create a client, a GraphQL client that's available to the components in our component tree, so that we can use useQuery from URQL, and then we can specify a query, and we can get the data. So now let's maybe work. Let's see how we are on time. We are 50 minutes. Wow, time went very fast. So let me just work quickly on the styles here. So we want to have Tailwind CSS. So Tailwind CSS is already built in. So if we go here, we can just remove that. And Tailwind, it's, let me just, we need to just use this. So we can paste that. And then we need to go to site, index, and we will use /main CSS. So everything that's available in stylesheet, it's available in our HTML files just directly after the root. So main CSS, it's main CSS here. So if I save and if I refresh, I should have some Tailwind styles. So let's see. If I write class bgred 500, it works. We have the Tailwind configured. So we could maybe think about make it a little bit prettier in terms of how it's displayed. So, for example, we could maybe here we could maybe do it so it spans the whole screen from the top to bottom, and BG gray. Gray. So something like that. And then And then maybe I would just use some snippets I already prepared. So normally I would like to have the size of my screen limited. Like that. So it limits it to a certain size. In this case, it's 1280. And yeah, what else? Maybe some padding. And now for the game, we would need to do a trick here. So let me think. There is this API for Steam. Let me just copy the URL and show you how it works. So if you go to store.steampowered.com API app details, app IDs, and you provide an idea of a game that exists on Steam. So in this case, it's a game called Payday. We have some structure here. We have description of the game. We have some requirements. And we also have a link to the screenshots and to like the assets we can use. So we could, for example, there is this CDN that fetches those headers for games. So, for example, let me just go to seed, grab this game. So there's a CDN on Cloudflare, Steam apps, the number, Steam ID, and then you just say library 600, 900, and it returns, the graphic of a game. So if I take another one, it returns them. So we could use that. So I will go here and I will create a very simple function called image URL. And this function takes ID, string. It uses this URL I showed you, and it inserts the ID, and it fetches the this image. So now with that, we could just use an image. So let me just copy some existing code so it's a little bit faster. And here, like that. So if I say game ID and game title, it doesn't work. Let's see. Undefined because, of course, we haven't asked for Steam ID. Works. So we have the images. So now it would be a matter of arranging them, in a columns. So for example, we could maybe do something like a grid with let's say 4 columns and a gap. And maybe at the bottom, And maybe should be bold. Bigger. So maybe something like that. Yeah. We have only 3 games. We are displaying them. Yeah, so I think, let's see how we are on time. It's almost an hour. So I think that would be pretty much it. We haven't really, we haven't done it in a way that's I display at the beginning, but the idea was to show you, how to integrate everything. So just applying certain styling is relatively easy compared to, how to configure database, how to create a table and Prisma, then GraphQL, and connecting this with React. So I will post the demo I showed you before on my GitHub. And then now maybe let's ask me your questions. What should be, what's not clear, or maybe what could we improve in this little application? So yeah, I don't see any right now, but if you have a question, now is the time. Okay, so I think if we have no questions, that's pretty much it. Creating a very simple React app that connects with a GraphQL server and uses Prisma to fetch data from a PostgreSQL database. If you're interested, let me know. We can work further on this application because there's so many topics we could cover. But for now, that's all. Thank you very much for watching. It was a pleasure to present to all of you, and see you in the next live stream. Bye-bye.